our plenary. Thanks. Again, I'm Laura Ray at the CSU Law Library, and I'm going to be moderating our plenary session here from Nicole Baker. Nicole is the Research and Engagement Librarian at the Kelvin Smith Library at Case Western Reserve University. She received her MSLIS from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and her MS in Education from Canisius College. Nicole is a librarian working at the intersection of AI, pedagogy, and open education, helping students and faculty navigate a rapidly shifting information landscape, one where generative AI is reshaping how research happens and what literacy means. She believes the future of information literacy is open, human-centered, and worth fighting for. Nicole's presentation is Designing Open Learning Tools in a Generative AI Era. And if you like, you can put questions in the Q&A panel, and I'll be sure that Nicole gets to them at the end of the session. Otherwise, the group chat is certainly available.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Can everybody see slides okay? Just making sure.
Yep. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so hello, everybody. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to kind of be talking about ideas of how we can bring generative AI into the open education tradition and how we can try to build things that maybe we hadn't been able to before. Anna's talk this morning, I feel like queued up a lot of what I'm going to say very nicely. And I just wanted to also kind of take a second and see if there's anybody in the audience that has experience with GitHub, has used the platform before. I'm going to be talking about my experience with very minimal coding background. In my master for library science degree, I took maybe one Python course and one SQL course for databases. So I'm still very new to this realm. I'm still learning a lot and trying to navigate these areas. But on GitHub, if it's something you're not familiar for, it's a cloud-based platform for software development, and the idea of forking something is very similar to what in the open realm we call remixing. So I ended up vibe coding my presentation slides because it felt very kind of meta to the conversation that I'm going to be talking about today. And first, though, I do want to kind of hear from everybody. So before we kind of jump in, I'm just curious, the vibe in the room of how do you feel about generative AI in your work? So I've got a few words on the slide. You can come up with your own. But are you curious, cautious, excited, overwhelmed, skeptical, a mix? More than one, lots of cautious, overwhelmed, some excited, cautiously excited, disappointed quite often. I'd agree with that. Skeptical, a mix. Okay, so you can keep dropping that in the chat. It does seem like we do kind of have a mix, but heavy on the skepticism, definitely overwhelmed, a little bit of excitement. And I think to kind of wrap up probably where a lot of us are with generative AI, I think a lot of us are just overwhelmed. I talk to a lot of people both in person, maybe at conferences, talking to my colleagues, talking to former colleagues, talking to people in education, outside of education, whether they work with AI, don't work with AI, want to, don't want to. Often we are just facing a lot of competing priorities, especially in education, that it can feel like the ground is just shifting beneath us and people keep handing us more things to hold while we're trying to walk on this shifting ground. And I think if you can kind of take a look at, some of the things that we're being asked to kind of look at, it kind of makes sense that we're feeling the ways that we are. So there's a lot of pressures that I think we're facing. And I'm going to kind of focus on two here, but obviously this is not an exhaustive list. But we're being asked to adapt to AI, right? We're asked to make policies, to bring it into our workflows, to create plans for how we're going to teach about it, use it. And all while, ideally not throwing out any frameworks or values that we already do our work on top of. But we don't really have maybe the necessary resources or tools or time to really overhaul or completely throw out everything we've already done and kind of start from scratch. And at the same time, for those of us, whether you're in the classroom teaching or supporting teachers, we probably now more than ever really need to be supporting students' critical thinking skills. Our students are obviously also feeling a lot of the same things that we are. They're being flooded by generative AI tools um, faster than we can even really evaluate what is the impact of using them or what is the impact of seeing AI generated content in a lot of different realms. And, these things aren't happening in isolation. We're also seeing a lot of people focusing more on active learning, focusing on student agency and engagement in the classroom, changes to the way that students are engaging with information. And these are all things that, AI didn't create those, but they're definitely making them or accelerating them and making them more of an immediate need. So we're I'm kind of thinking about what are some ways that we could try to tackle some of these issues. And the first thing that always comes to my mind is open, right? Which openness means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, especially even in this audience. Maybe this is the foundation of the work you do. Maybe you're an open librarian. Maybe you use open texts in your teaching, or you could be new to it and just starting to explore to see what it might mean for you. But what I want to kind of focus on is how we can apply this tradition of open or this ethic to connect to what generative artificial intelligence can potentially make possible for us. So I'm going to kind of lay out what I mean by that. So open educational practice is kind of built on the belief that knowledge should be accessible, and that education also could improve when we're working together instead of working in isolation. We're sharing our materials, we're building off of what others have built. So, we think of like platforms like OER Commons, Pressbooks. There's so many publishing platforms where you can see books, materials, tools that others have created that you can then use or remix for your own, things that are tagged with Creative Commons licensing. There's the 5 Rs, which is retaining, reusing, revising, remixing, and redistributing. And I will share too, one of the things that I have on these slides, which I'll share the link to towards the end, is just some resources that I've kind of been engaging with and that kind of relate to these slides. So these are available. So those are kind of the traditions of, what we think maybe you comes to mind for you when you're thinking about open educational practice. And what's changing is the way that generative AI might be able to extend what one person could create. So, I think what's really important here, though, I think hopefully everybody here could agree with me, is what we really need to focus on is having that human expertise, the human in the loop, human-centered evaluation, where instead of just having a generative AI tool produce lots of noise or slop, we need to have an expert in the room or the expertise that we have evaluating anything that we are creating with generative AI, to make sure, again, that we're not just producing more slop. And I think part of that is making sure that we're in the roles that we have, whether it's a faculty member, librarian, instructional designer, administration, we need to not just be either blindly adopting or blindly rejecting these tools, but making sure that we're leading the way that we're engaging with these tools, teaching our students about how to navigate them, teaching our students AI literacy skills, and making sure I feel like we have kind of a great position here in education to try to lead at least what our students are learning about these tools. And I think, that's kind of, I do want to just continue to highlight the risk of unmitigated AI use is that it's just going to continue to lead to the slop. And so if we're going to think about building things with generative AI, building things that we're going to openly share with generative AI, one thing that I want to touch on is the idea of kind of thinking about what good design looks like. So I did see someone ask a question in the chat, and thank you, Scott, for answering. One of the things that I'm kind of leading us up to is the idea of vibe coding, which is using generative AI tools. Basically, you use a generative AI tool and give them, this is the vibe that I'm going for. I want to create a tool. For example, when I created these slides, I want to create a PowerPoint slide that I can post my code on GitHub so anybody can use the code. And these are the additional tools. I wanted to have a references button on my slide that was hidden, so it doesn't take up all the room, but anybody can click on it and use it. And there's a few other interactive elements. And then what I would do is take the code that I personally do not have the expertise to write on my own from scratch. put that into a platform, and then I can plug my content into the slides, and still go through that iterative process with a generative AI tool too to get it to where I want it to be. So one thing that I think is really important if we're thinking about building tools with generative AI is thinking about different design principles. When I'm thinking about building tools for teaching, I'm obviously trying to make an easier access point for material that's already out there, whether that's a LibGuide or an OER for a class that you're using, and try to kind of add a different entry point for students to engage with content. So I've been thinking a lot about multimedia learning theory, and there's 4 principles here that I've kind of pulled out and then also added accessibility in UDL. And again, I will share the slides so you can kind of click through these, but thinking about modality is trying to add maybe adding narration and visuals together. Coherence is making sure that, the content that you have on your tool or on your page is not repetitive, that you're kind of cutting out any excess material that doesn't really need to be there for whatever this activity or tool is doing. Signaling is definitely more on the design side of including cues, drawing arrows between things, connecting ideas, pointing out main ideas. Segmenting is like chunking, making sure that it's not an overwhelming wall of text and that maybe students can kind of go through the content at their own pace. And then what I think is always really important, especially if you're building something that's going to be web-based, is making sure that you're leading with accessibility and universal design principles at mind. So making sure if there's images that there's alt text, making sure there's proper headings in your code and your format, and also just making sure you're building anything that you are with a diverse body of students in mind, making sure there's multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression. So each of these, I kind of created a sample like prompt that you can use to include in your prompt for a generative AI tool. Um, I find that for the most part, I think the more that I've coded, I think so. I personally use Claude, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But I'm finding that after I've coded another tool, that it's kind of understanding that I want to make sure I'm using proper headings. But the first time you're using a tool, especially if you haven't shared anything or if you're not logged in using a tool, you want to make sure that you're fully explaining the principles. Like if you wanted to include design principles, that you're including that in your prompt. Otherwise, the tool's not going to know that you want to include that. Um, so just a small little example here. I actually had Claude generate this example. I'm sure, it might look similar to something you might put on a LibGuide or a website page, probably better formatted than this, but we've got a long title, library research and AI, everything you need to know about using AI in your research process. I list a bunch of tools, I list databases, there's some colorful tags, a lot of notes. And I think content like this is important to have. And what I've been finding, which is what led me to exploring vibe coding, is that, we can create great guides and I can guide students to it, but whether they read it or not, I can't really control that. And I can't entirely verify it unless I want to create a quiz. But I'm trying to find a way to have maybe a tool, an interactive tool that students can go to instead, where they're clicking through it, exploring the information in a different, hopefully more engaging way. Um, so when I applied the multimedia learning theory principles, what I really did is I just kind of chunked out the information, right? So thinking about where are students, our guide is where are students using AI in their research process, trying to chunk out those different areas that they could use it. And if I were to create this tool, I would have students be able to click on each stage. So it's signaling how they can kind of switch between different groups, making sure that it's just the most important information they need to know for the specific content, and they can go through it at their own pace. And even with creating something like this, I would probably still say, okay, after we explore this tool, now let's go back to our original text or our original guide to help them kind of keep navigating the full content that we have to go through together. So that's just a small example of what a good design might look like if you're creating an interactive tool. But now I think what we really want to talk about is how you can actually build these things. So this is a concept. I think vibe coding has changed how I'm approaching my work and trying to think about ways to, like I said, to engage students differently with material that I know is important and I know I need them to learn. I mentioned that I don't have a strong background in coding, and that it's definitely been a journey, which I'll talk about towards the end of the process presentation. I've learned a lot along the way, and I'm hoping I can share some of the lessons I've learned too. So if this is something that's new to you and you're interested, hopefully you can pick up kind of where I'm at now, and don't have to go through some of the struggles that I did when I first started. But let me give you an example of what I mean with vibe coding. So again, I think if you could think about a time that you've ever worked with a tool or a platform and you wish like, oh, I just wish there was one thing that I could change on this. I feel like the most frequent I experienced this, I started my career as a high school teacher, and the different platforms and tools that I was required to use by my district, there were so many times that I was like, if I could just add one button here or one arrow or one different tool, or if I could combine these tools, it would have made my life so much easier. And I do think that vibe coding, in some situations, it's definitely not a solution for all issues. But it could be something that could help in those situations. So using generative AI can kind of help fill those skill gaps. I mean, like I said, so I have a kind of a counter down here. This was one of the things I vibe coded. If you saw it as I changed the slide, it counts up. Overall, I maybe took about 5 hours vibe coding, and it wasn't just in one sitting. I think it was, I started putting the presentation together, and I created the template of what I wanted the PowerPoint layout to be. I had Claude fill it out. I kind of included ideas of how much text I wanted on the slide, how many headings, how many boxes, what my color scheme might be, all these things that I personally don't know how to code. So it's filling that skill gap for me. And then I go in and include my human expertise, add my content that I want to be in the slide. Um, and that's all fine and great, but I think the most important thing that, again, I want to keep highlighting is the importance of the human expertise anytime we're using generative AI tools. Where I have found the most success is tapping into community. So whether that's talking to my colleagues who do know how to code within an education setting and they're coding frequently and they already know these tools that I'm newly learning, or if it's friends that I have outside of education who do code for a living. The more that I have been reaching out to them and talking to them and saying, well, yeah, I'm using GitHub now, and I've tried this new platform. And they're like, you're doing what? Like, what do you mean you're doing this? We need to sit down and talk. I have so much I could tell you. And that's truly where I've learned the most is from the communities who already have the expertise in this field. Trying to do these things in isolation, you might get there and you might be able to just kind of like smash a hammer against things until it works, but the process is going to be much more strenuous than if you kind of start developing that community, exploring who's already doing these things, who is the expert in these fields, who would be willing to, share their recommendations of that's how I found that GitHub was a platform that I could host my code on for free in a way that allows others to then remix my code if they were interested. Um, and ultimately, at the end of kind of this combination of open practices and open sharing, while using generative AI tools to fill those gaps, to build tools that you're hoping to create, if you are, what you're going to end up with is this custom built tool or activity or website that's specific to your context because you've added all of the context, whether by hand with your human content or in the prompts that you've used with generative AI, to kind of build the tool. And I see a question, how much active time for you was included in that 5 hours? So I mean, with the coding, I think 5 hours overall. I started putting the actual slides together last week. And for me, I just kept having little ideas like adding this little counter. And so I would go in and kind of tweak it. So I will say 5 active hours of a mix of prompting Claude. The total time of prompting Claude is not that much. It's hard to quantify. I'd have to probably go back and look through the chat and see if I could calculate the times. But I think total maybe an hour, 2 hours max of coding. And then my process, which I'll share more tools later, is going into the code itself, plugging in my text. And there have been little things that I've picked up along the way. So I am learning a little bit more of code, like creating these lists. I'll go in, I'll say, I don't really like that, or maybe I want to add an extra. Or when I went in and added my resources, I can go in and edit that on the code. That's things I've picked up. So I think active time of not just letting Claude work at least like 3 to 3.5 hours. And part of that is my perfectionist. It probably didn't need to take me that long. But I think for an example like this, where I coded an entire slide deck, had I done it without generative AI, I could have taken years or lots of money to pay someone to create it for me. But thank you for the question. And then, so my example of my most recent kind of example of this that I kind of want to walk you through my process of what I've done. So I had an instruction request for a philosophy class, and this class covered kind of AI and the human mind. So the students in this class were actively using generative AI tools all semester. The professor told me that going into the class, the students did have a wide variety of experience using AI, from students who really didn't want to use it, but were curious about it and excited about the class, to students who started using it in high school and said that they hadn't written anything without ChatGPT for over 2 years. So there's a wide variety of feelings about AI, experience using AI. And the assignment that they were going to have to do is write an argumentative essay, research essay, and they were going to have to use generative AI tools at some point in the research process and write more about kind of evaluating and reflecting on their experience. So I was asked to kind of come in and talk about ways that students could use generative AI at different points in the research process. And this kind of really raised a question that I keep coming back to, that I wanted to bring to the students, which is, if they're using these generative AI tools in their work and in their learning, when are they actually thinking? Are they actually thinking? Are they actually learning? So I kind of kept coming back to this question and decided that I wanted to create an interactive tool to really try to capture their attention, to, since I knew that they were using generative AI, show them, how I personally might use generative AI as an example, but also get them to interact with a tool to help them through this process of thinking about their learning and thinking about their thinking. So this became kind of my design question for the tool. So as an example of how I think my prompts have evolved, I think if I were to make this a year or two ago, before I really started exploring prompting with generative AI, I might have started with something that's just saying, make me an activity addressing generative AI use in the research process, which, looking at it, very broad. It might give me a worksheet. It's not very descriptive. And so things that I try to sit down and think through the prompts that I'm writing before. Obviously, I go into a generative AI tool. I think a lot of the materials that Anna shared are phenomenal. I do recommend reading through things to kind of work through this process of identifying how you can best write a strong prompt. But some of the things that I keep trying to think through when I'm adding a prompt is thinking about the learning goals. What are the students going to need to do? What do I need to make sure that this tool or this activity that I'm making is reaching? Maybe the students need to evaluate AI generated sources for credibility. Adding student context without giving, obviously, any descriptive information about students. We need to make sure that we're keeping privacy private for students, not inputting any of their personal information. So the context that I had, their first year undergraduates, maybe philosophy majors, they have a mix of prior AI experience, focusing on any AI literacy in sessions that you really want to include. So I wanted to think about having students identify which cognitive steps they're actually delegating to AI and why they might be choosing those steps. And then also including a reflective requirement. So what might that look like if you don't use AI for that step, and kind of pushing back on that, or even taking it a step further and having them think about what they might be losing out on when they are delegating those steps to AI. And I do also continuously recommend to make sure that not only are you including it in your prompts, but in your human in the loop when you're evaluating anything that you create towards the end, remembering that you're looking for accessibility and making sure that anything you code has the proper headings built in. If you have images, that they have alt text. I have found Claude to be really helpful, but still kind of going through the WCAG principles to make sure anything you create that's web-based is accessible. And then openly sharing anything that you do create so that others can build off of it, remix it, use it for their own contexts. So again, this is what led me to create this tool. So this is openly licensed, it's interactive. Forkable is the to fork a resource on GitHub is basically remixing it. Someone could take the code, make it their own. So the way that I decided to kind of lay out the research process, I chose just 5 steps. And this is a tool that I brought up with the class. They all opened it on their own and had time to kind of explore it. I tried to keep it really simple on the page. They were able to kind of click through the different stages of the research process. And part of the instruction session that I told students was that, this is my opinion. So like I color coded each stage of the research process with what I thought should be heavy on the human judgment, what might be a shared space, and where a high AI risk zone might be. And I even told them if they completely disagreed, if they completely agreed. I did have some reflection questions after they went through it where we kind of talked about, do you agree with the way that I color coded it? Would you change it? Kind of where would you sit with your AI use and what you feel comfortable with? So to give you an example, for the first stage, explore and focus, and you can see here, very obvious, I feel like looking at it, that I use generative AI to kind of build this format. But what I built in and what I added from my perspective of what I wanted the students to learn is, at this first stage of the research process where you're exploring what topics are you interested in, what questions you have that you might want to answer, bringing your own lived experiences, your values. Those are the very strong things that you're bringing into a research process. Making sure that you're, intellectually struggling with things that you're actually interested in. Those are the human strengths of this area. And then, of course, they needed to know how Gen AI might be able to help them if this was the stage that they chose to use generative AI in. So maybe they could come up with suggested topics off of a broader area they're interested in, think about a different angle they hadn't thought of before, maybe try to narrow down a research question that they had, or even just come up with potential background reading to help them get oriented to a debate before they do their own research. And so for each stage, I included the what could go wrong if you're over delegating to generative AI at this stage, and then a reflective question. And this was where a lot of great conversation did come up with the class. I actually, towards the end of our session, the student who said he hadn't written anything without ChatGPT for 2 years said he at least was going to start rethinking his knee-jerk reaction to continuously reach for ChatGPT for everything, which I took as a win. But so for example here, what goes wrong if you are only using AI for this explore and focus session and you're not coming up with anything on your own, right? You're going to get very generic topics that have probably are very bland and maybe have nothing to do with who you are as a person or what you're interested in. The background reading could be hallucinations. You might not actually understand what you're reading because you're just skimming instead of actually doing your own research. You might not know where that information is coming from. And then a reflective question here, the one that I added was, who decides what a good research question is? Do you want to let an AI tool tell you what a good question is, or do you think that should be something that's left up to you or the department that you're in or the field that you're going to go in? Do you really want to let a tool who, their data comes from you don't know where, be the one that tells you what you should be researching? And I think some of these reflective questions were really kind of pushing the students. I think it was also helpful that it was a philosophy class, so they were very open to thinking about their thinking. We had the pause and reflect questions that we kind of went through where students were identifying where they might feel comfortable using AI and where they might feel really kind of scared or skeptical. I guess I don't want to say scared, but they might not want to use generative AI at that stage. And then I included just an extra thing just because I knew I was going to openly share this, kind of potential class discussions that could happen. And what I felt was really important, anything that I create, anything that I use with generative AI, I include a transparency statement. So I built this one out very in depth because I wanted to show students how they should be kind of sharing AI transparency. So I shared the tools that I used. I used Claude for kind of the framework development. It helped me come up with this node structure because my idea in my mind was a very convoluted, way too many arrows. And so this was very simplified, and that was very nice. And then the process that I went through of, thinking through what information I wanted to share with students, using generative AI to using Claude specifically to come up with the code, and then going back through, making sure, my if I input my content, it wasn't changed. And if it was, kind of bringing it back to where I was, making sure it fits the class that I was teaching, and just kind of including all this information. What was human driven, what was generated by AI, and again, why this matters, because that was something that I really wanted to hit home with students. And I just also want to say the design of this tool wasn't accidental. I'm really trying to kind of hone in on these multimedia learning theory design principles. So the discrete stages, having the stages hidden, so it's not just a wall of text that everybody's looking at, being able to kind of click through the different stages on their own, which also leads into the learner agency. Having those arrows that kind of remind students that the research process is pretty iterative. You're probably going to be going back to other steps, and that's good and that's okay, and you should be doing that. And just making sure that it was specific to that content, right? We talked about other things in the class. I went on to talk about databases, and we talked about keywords and what databases should they be trying, and we looked at research guides. So this wasn't a replacement for all of the other information that they need, but it was just an easy kind of, low stakes tool for them to kind of start engaging with this idea a little bit more and kind of prompt their thinking. Um, and yes, I will be sharing the links, the slide link. Yes, sorry. Um, so now I do kind of want to share how I got here, because my journey has not been very straightforward. I like to be transparent about the process. I do think I want to lean more now into like learning out loud. I really enjoyed how Anna said that she's been sharing things on LinkedIn and getting feedback. I'm definitely very inspired by that, because I have definitely had very messy parts that I have learned a lot from, though. And I'm hoping I can share that with you as well. So again, this process has not been a straight line. It started actually at the last institution I was at as a librarian. We were getting a lot of requests from faculty of how they could be bringing AI literacy skills into their class when they're already so overwhelmed. They are still trying to learn how to use these tools and what they might mean, and if they even should use these tools. And they also didn't have time to sacrifice any content that they're teaching in class. We're already fitting so much content into a semester of class, and now here's another thing that we have to add on. How do I get rid of a week of content just to talk about AI? So myself and some colleagues started kind of brainstorming, what can we do that's maybe I don't want to say lower effort, but a smaller undertaking for faculty to start being able to kind of navigating what that might look like, beyond just saying, put a statement in your syllabus that you're going to use it or you're not. And good luck. So we started playing around with the idea of creating a tool where we could brainstorm activities that, faculty could just explore them and use them as kind of a springboard to get ideas of how they could teach about AI literacy with their specific course content, whether they're having students use AI tools or not. Either way, I think including AI literacy skills is going to be very important. So we did end up building a tool, which I'll talk about in another few slides, that were based on pedagogical frame and other frameworks that we think are important to ground any work that AI is showing up in. So we focused on Bloom's taxonomy, the Universal Design for Learning, and an AI literacy framework developed by Dr. Kara Kennedy, which was based on UNESCO's digital literacy frameworks. And based on all of those, we tried to come up with AI literacy activities and created this bank that we were able to share with professors. And through that process, there was a lot of iteration. When we first started it, I was using a free version of ChatGPT, and I ran into a lot of walls. I ran into, running out of tokens because it was a free version. And this is where that process of tapping into the community really kind of hit me in the face. Once I started talking to colleagues, even within the library, that's when I found out about GitHub. So when ChatGPT was telling me I had to buy a domain and I should try sharing my code on like Squarespace and other websites that are just not built for what exactly I was doing, I was like, I know this has to be possible. Someone out there knows how to do this. And I was like, well, then I guess I should ask people out there. And that's when I really kind of started really tapping into the expertise of not just my colleagues within the library, but across departments, and also outside of education. I've learned a lot. I know what an SVG file is now. I've created one. I'm slowly learning more about GitHub. So it really has opened a lot of new doors, and kind of a whole new world of possibilities of things that I could create for my instruction sessions that hopefully will get students more engaged. And more recently, I've been focusing on trying to include these multimedia learning theories, design principles in my prompts to make sure that not only are the tools that I'm making accessible, but also making sure that they're not just more overwhelming AI slop or just, walls of text for students. If my goal is to make sure it's a different way to access materials, I want to make sure that I'm kind of including these design principles in the things that I'm creating. Um, so again, just another thought about the process. It's not going to be perfect. These tools are not perfect. They're far from it. I have had hours of broken code. I've built things that didn't work. I built things that were not accessible. I built things that I realized I would have to scrap and start over because I just hadn't organized properly and it wasn't going to work. But every time throughout the process that this has happened, I've learned something new and I've learned new communities that I can tap into. I've learned to write stronger prompts that are more effective. Um, so I do want to take a minute and hear from you, and see if there are potential things that you might be able to vibe code for yourself. So think about a time that maybe you've had to explain something and wished you had a better tool or a better visual. Or maybe there's something in your workflow that you're sick of doing and you're like, there must be a way to make this easier. Um, or a question that you get asked all the time and you have to refer to this, like, I wrote this long document, your answer's in here and no one seems to engage with this. Why? So if anybody can brainstorm ideas, feel free to chop them and drop them in the chat. Remediating not so accessible documents. That's a big one. Mm. Self-disclosing AI involvement. Yeah. Oh, sweet. Thanks, Scott.
Nicole, while you're getting responses, I have a question from
Sure.
Kathleen Beryl. She's wondering where you stored the activity bank.
That is on. So we built it in an Excel file, and then we turned it into a JSON file, and that is on GitHub. So it is available on GitHub, and I'll have a link to that at the end as well. It is available. Interactive slides, yeah. Vibe coding music, visual tools, yep. Quicker citation. Yes, these are all great ideas and things that you can vibe code. I've also seen something that I'm thinking about for a course that I teach is maybe trying to make an interactive version of my rubric so students can kind of, for their final project in the maybe not next semester, but the semester after, having a better interactive version of a rubric because I feel like students aren't looking at it anyway. So if I could find a different way to pop that out to them, they might be able to. So yes, these are all great ideas. So I do want to take a second. I know we're kind of running low on time, but to kind of pop out to the broader context of what this might mean for open education. Um, in my heart of hearts, I do want to hope and believe we can capitalize on the insanity that is generative AI to increase open practices, to maybe increase pedagogical practices, hopefully increase OER adoption. If we're able to cut down on some time where we can create more customized ancillary materials or question banks or examples, or building custom tools or activities and hopefully making things easier for faculty where previously maybe it took grants and years to build these things. We still need to focus on the human expertise when we're doing this, but I think if we're able to cut down on, I think what it can often be the biggest barrier is and expertise to maybe code something like this. And then when we compare that with the like skill gap of generative AI and the time gap that we have with openly licensing things, that's obviously just going to kind of the impact is going to multiply because more people will be able to access the customized thing you made customized thing that you made and be able to customize it back specifically to their own context. So one more specific example, I talked about the first tool that we made where we wanted to create kind of this bank of activities. And when we were coming up with things, my colleague actually showed me this version of Bloom's taxonomy. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. I hadn't previously seen it. And so I was talking about Bloom's taxonomy, and my colleague was like, what are you talking about? Triangle? Like, what are you saying? And so when they pulled this up and showed it to me, my first thought was, this would be great if we could like click on it. And that was kind of the beginning of us, playing around with vibe coding, where I opened a chat with ChatGPT, explained our context of what we wanted to do, and said, I have this PDF. How do I make it into something I can click? And since it was openly licensed, I was able to, with guidance from ChatGPT, I learned that you can make an image and interactable by making an SVG. So I used Adobe Illustrator. Yes, Adobe Illustrator I kind of traced over it, and that creates a code, which then I was able to edit the code to make this interactive. So it's the process of using generative AI to turn a static OER into an interactive tool that we've openly licensed. And really quickly, because I do want to save time just in case there's other questions, very much echoing what Anna said again this morning, is that I am really the space I've been learning so much in, it has been kind of social media and heavily on LinkedIn. As I'm hearing names, I've just been following people and kind of seeing the things that they're publishing or creating about AI and OER or with AI and OER. And I might not agree with everything, but I think that's what's really important is we need to make sure that we're not just kind of sitting in our echo chambers of I love AI or I hate AI or I just don't want to talk about it anymore. I think it's really important for us to be engaging with people who are doing great work in this area and kind of exploring what things might look like and what things maybe shouldn't look like. So I do have links to some websites and LinkedIn here because I've slowly been following people over the past year and it's taken time to get there. And I'm excited to continuously learn about more people. So I do have links here as well. And I guess kind of the last thing I'll leave you with is an invitation. Everything here is remixable. It's open on GitHub, and just kind of a challenge of things that you could try this week. If you came up with an idea of something that you could make, maybe try a prompt. Think about including the accessibility. Think about adding the multimedia learning theory design principles. See what it comes back with. See if it works. Maybe explore a tool that I've shared or visit someone on my resources link that I have enjoyed following. See what you can learn from them. See if you can remix one of their tools. And if you build something, make sure you share it, right? Whether it's OER Commons, share it on LinkedIn or any of the kind of listservs that have also been shared here today. So with that, I'll thank you all, and I will pop the link to the slides in the chat. But if there are any other questions, my Zoom tools are always in my way.
Yes, we have around 3 minutes, so if you would like to put a question either in the chat or the Q&A.
Yes, I will post it in Discord as soon as the Zoom I'm off. I'll post it in the Discord. And I'll be available in there for questions too. I think something I've been thinking about is even creating a small guide of, tools that I have found useful. So if someone's interested in starting to vibe code things and kind of play around with it, I can kind of create my own little guide of what I have found that works. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm still learning a lot. But I'd love to just kind of, give what I have for others to build on. Yes.
Okay, I loved your idea about thinking um, about open pedagogy, activity rather than a worksheet. Which other activities, in your opinion, your learners enjoy the most? What type of activities your learners enjoy the most?
It really depends class to class. It's tough because it really depends class to class. And especially as a librarian, it's so difficult because we're coming in as a one shot. So we might not know the vibe of the class. But from the experience that I've had, I think I've had a lot of luck if I don't ask students to talk to me. Anytime that I can either have them talk to each other or communicate with me anonymously. I think that's what's most useful. So I try to build that, which is why I liked building these tools where maybe they explore on their own. And you can also include things like a link to a Google form or a link to a Mentimeter built into these tools. So if you need to capture student information, you could do that in a way that's private. But I think that's the best luck I've had, where they don't have to talk to me, at least in front of the entire class.
So we have a question from Heather. What precautions did you take with Claude or other AI to not have further access to your data than what you want it to work with?
So I use Claude in the web browser. I do currently now use Pro. When I first started, I wasn't. But when I was creating the staircase tool, I actually presented it at a conference last week, so I needed a little more help. So I did end up getting the Pro account, but I don't use Claude Cowork. I'm scared. I'm not sure. I haven't learned enough about that yet to fully explore it on my own. So I've used the browser, and I think especially from being a public school teacher, I assume anything I put online is just available everywhere. So I don't put in anything that I wouldn't want people to have access to. So if there's content that I don't want to put into an AI tool, I'll include in my prompt, build these slides, but leave blanks for the content. And if you don't know how to add your content into it, you can also ask, like I've told Claude, I don't know how to add this in. Can you point out what points in the code I need to go in and add my specific types of content? So you can still code things like this without putting your own content within it, and ask the tool to create a guide for you. How do I now go in and put in my content? What lines in the code do I need to add this?
Okay, with that, folks, we're at 12:01, and thank you so much, Nicole. Wonderful presentation. And we have a lot to think about over lunch